I turned 80 in 2018. Helen had died the year before, in October, and the winter that followed her death was the longest winter I can remember. In 82 years of Maine winters. Not in temperature, not in snowfall, but in the specific quality of quiet that a house takes on when the person who gave it its sound is gone. I turned 80 in that house, alone, in January, and I sat in this chair by this fire, and I thought about the decade ahead of me and what I wanted it to be, and what I wanted to avoid. I've been thinking about that again lately, about what I actually avoided and what I didn't, about the things I walked into anyway, despite knowing better, despite the long years of accumulated understanding that I brought into my 80s, about what it actually costs to be wrong about things at 80 when the margin is smaller than it was at 50, when the years you're spending on a mistake are years you can't easily recover. I'm 82 years old. My name is Walter, and today I want to talk about 3 things I wish I'd avoided after 80. Not everything I got wrong. The list of what I've gotten wrong at every age is long, and most of it was necessary. And most of it taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. These 3 are different. These 3 I knew, or should have known, and did anyway. And the doing anyway has cost me things I want to say plainly, because saying them plainly might be worth something to someone who is coming up on 80, or who is already in it, or who loves someone who is. 3 things, not more. Because at 82, I've learned that 3 things said clearly and honestly, and with the full story attached, are worth more than 13 things said quickly. Sit with me. The first thing I wish I'd avoided was letting the winter of grief become the permanent season of the interior. I want to say what I mean by that precisely, because the words are important, and I don't want them to suggest something I don't mean. I am not saying I should have grieved less. I'm not saying I should have gotten over Helen faster, or more efficiently, or in the prescribed number of stages that someone has decided grief should take. I'm saying something different. I'm saying that at some point, sometime in the 2nd year, or possibly the 3rd, the grief shifted from being something that was happening to me into something I was choosing to maintain. And the choosing was, at least partly, not in my best interest and not in the interest of the people who were still here. Helen died in October of 2017. The first year after her death was what it was. The particular fog and weight of new grief, the not sleeping and the not eating right, and the walking into rooms and forgetting why I'd walked in, and then standing there and understanding that the reason I'd walked in was to find her, and she wasn't there. The first year was honest grief, raw and immediate, and I don't think there was any choosing in it. The grief was doing what grief does. The 2nd year, something shifted. The fog lifted enough that I could see where I was, which was a man who had organized his interior life almost entirely around loss. Around the absent person, around the remembered life, around the question of how to be in a world that was fundamentally wrong. Not wrong in some philosophical sense, but wrong in the specific practical sense that the person who was supposed to be in it was not in it. I could see that this was the organization of my interior, and I could see that it was becoming fixed in a way that was different from the first year's rawness. It was becoming a way of being rather than a response to an event. I did things that maintained it. I kept the Helen side of the wardrobe exactly as she'd left it, which is not the same as keeping it because I wasn't ready to change it, but was, by the 3rd year, more like keeping it as a declaration that the world had stopped. I didn't change the arrangement of the living room, which she had arranged to her particular specifications, and which I don't find as comfortable as I'd find a different arrangement. I kept cooking the meals she'd liked rather than the meals I actually preferred, as if the meals were a form of tribute. I kept spending the money the way she would have wanted me to spend it, or the way I imagined she would have wanted me to spend it, rather than the way I actually wanted to. I was living the life as she had organized it rather than the life as I was now living it. I'm not saying those things were wrong exactly. I'm saying they accumulated into a way of being that kept the interior in a permanent winter that was starting by the 3rd year, to limit things that I wanted not to be limited. It was limiting my willingness to do new things, because new things felt like a departure from the life Helen and I had built, a moving away from her rather than a continuing with her. It was limiting my presence in conversations, because the half of me that was always with her was not available to be with whoever was actually in the room. It was limiting the quality of my relationships with David and Susan, who were trying to be in the present tense of a relationship with their father, and finding him partially absent. His attention distributed between the room in October 2017. David said something to me, gently, about 18 months after Helen died. We were on the phone on a Sunday and he said, "Pop, are you all right?" And I said what I always said, which was yes. And he said, "I don't mean are you okay? I mean, are you still in there?" It was a strange way to put it and exactly right. He was asking whether the self that was his father was still present in the person he was talking to, or whether the grief had swallowed it. And the answer at that moment was that the grief had swallowed more of me than I'd admitted to myself or to anyone else. I want to try to describe what that swallowing actually felt like from the inside, because I think people who haven't been in it may not understand what I mean when I say the grief became something I was choosing to maintain rather than something that was happening to me. It's not a dramatic thing. It doesn't announce itself as a choice. It arrives as a very subtle shift in how you relate to the possibility of the day feeling different from how it's been feeling. On any given morning, there's a small branch in the road. You can either orient toward the grief, let it organize the morning, settle into the heaviness, and let it be the weather of the day. Or you can do the small things that move you in a different direction. Put the kettle on with intention. Go to the shop before the grief gains its usual morning momentum. Call someone before the silence sets in. The branch is small. The choice between the two paths looks like nothing from the outside. But you make it every morning, and the direction you choose becomes, over weeks and months, the direction you're traveling. I was choosing, in the second and third year, to stay in the grief direction. Not dramatically, not all day, not in ways that would have alarmed anyone watching, but reliably enough that the travel was in the wrong direction, away from the life that was still available to be lived, and toward the life that had already been lived, the one that was over, the one that I was organizing the interior around as if organizing around it would somehow keep it from being over. It doesn't work that way. The life is over regardless of how you organize your interior. The organizing around it doesn't preserve it. It only prevents you from fully inhabiting the one that is still going. What I wish I'd done differently is what I eventually did do, but sooner made the distinction between honoring Helen and hiding in her. Honoring Helen means tending the lupines in June and keeping the green cup and saying her name and telling the grandchildren the stories of her. It means carrying her forward as a presence in the ongoing life rather than backward, as a monument to a stopped one. Hiding in Helen means using the grief as the reason not to participate in the present, not to answer the invitation, not to engage with the new person, not to rearrange the living room, not to admit that the life is still going and still mine and still worth inhabiting on its own terms. The hiding is the misuse of the grief. It takes something real, the loss, the love, the genuine hole in the world, and makes it into a reason for absence from the world rather than a different quality of presence in it. I made this distinction eventually. By the time I turned 80, I was beginning to make it. By 82, I make it more reliably, not perfectly. But I wish I'd made it sooner, in that second and third year, when the choice was becoming clearer, but I wasn't quite looking at it directly. The interior winter lasted longer than it needed to. And the longer it lasted, the more it cost, in presence, in relationship, in the quality of the time that was still mine. The second thing I wish I'd avoided was the specific pride that prevents asking for help with the body. I want to be honest about this one in a way that might be uncomfortable to say, because the honest version is not flattering to the version of me that was practicing the pride. The pride I'm talking about is not the general self-sufficiency that men of my formation develop, though that's related to it. It's something more specific. It's the particular pride of a man who has been physically capable his whole life, who built his livelihood on physical capability, who spent 45 years doing physical work, who was strong and able-bodied and proud of both, encountering the changes that his 80s are bringing to his body, and refusing to acknowledge them, or acknowledging them privately and privately managing them, rather than asking for the help that would have made the managing less costly. I had a bad fall in the shop in the autumn of 2019. I was on a step stool reaching for something on the high shelf, a thing I'd done hundreds of times. and the step stool shifted and I came down hard on my left side. I lay on the shop floor for a few minutes, which is not the same as being unconscious, but is a condition of complete physical assessment that you find yourself doing when you hit the ground unexpectedly at 80 years old. Nothing was broken. The bruising was extensive and the soreness lasted 3 weeks, and I walked badly for 2 weeks, and I told David when he called on Sunday that I'd tweaked my back in the shop. I did not tell him I'd fallen. I did not tell him I'd lain on the shop floor. I did not tell him it had frightened me, which it had. Not in the dramatic way of I thought I was dying, but in the quiet way of I understand now that this can happen and I need to think about what that means. I am not proud of the lying by omission. I'm saying it plainly because I think it's important. And because I think it's common in men of my age and formation. And because the cost of it was not just the specific cost of that specific fall, but the larger cost of maintaining a fiction of physical competence that was becoming less and less accurate and that required more and more effort to maintain, and that kept the people who loved me from being able to offer help that was actually appropriate to the situation. There's a version of physical dignity that is worth maintaining. There's a version of it that is useful and that serves real purposes. It keeps you going to the shop, keeps you engaged with the physical world, keeps you from the particular kind of collapse that can happen when older people stop doing things. Because the doing has become harder. That version of physical dignity I do not regret, but there is another version of it, the version that keeps you from telling your son you fell, that keeps you from accepting the grab bar in the shower that David wanted to install, and that you said you didn't need, that keeps you from the regular appointment with the doctor about the thing that's been persisting longer than it should. That version of physical dignity is not dignity at all. It's a performance of capability that prioritizes the performance over the well-being of the person performing it. I let David install the grab bar eventually. I let Susan set up the regular check-in call that happens every Thursday, and that includes a genuine report on the body, rather than the managed fine I'd been giving for years. I told David about the fall, eventually, not that autumn, but a year later, when I could tell it without it feeling like an admission of failure. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Pop, I wish you'd told me." Not angry, not accusatory, just the honest statement of a son who wanted to know. And I understood, hearing him say it, that the not telling had been about me and not about him, had been about maintaining my own image of myself as a man who handles his own business, rather than about protecting him from worry. He was going to worry anyway. What I denied him was the ability to worry accurately, to know what was actually happening and to offer the appropriate help, rather than the help that addressed the fiction. What I wish I'd avoided is the maintaining of the physical competence fiction, past the point where the maintaining was in my own interest or in the interest of the people who loved me. I'm still working on this. The impulse runs very deep, but I'm better at it than I was. And what being better at it has given me is something I describe as a lighter relationship with my own aging body. Less fighting it, less managing the image of it, more honest accounting of what it needs and what it can no longer do the way it used to do, and more willingness to accept the things that would make it safer and more workable without the internal cost of the pride that kept me from accepting them. Let me say something specific about what the lighter relationship with the body has actually produced, because I think the consequences of changing this are worth describing clearly. Before I changed it, while I was still in the full operation of the physical competence fiction, I was spending a significant amount of energy on the management of it. Every interaction with David or Susan that touched on the body required the management, the preparation of the right answer to how are you feeling, the monitoring of how much to say, and how to frame what I said, so that the picture it presented was of a man who was aging but managing, not a man who was finding some things more difficult than he'd expected, and more difficult than he was admitting. That management took energy I didn't have to spare. I was spending energy on the maintenance of a fiction rather than on the actual navigation of my actual situation. When I started being more honest about the body, when I started saying, "David, my knee has been bothering me more than I mentioned," or telling Susan what was actually going on rather than the summary version, the management cost went away. Not all at once, not entirely, because the habit is deep, but substantially. And the energy that had been going into the management became available for other things, for actually thinking about what the body needed and doing something about it, rather than just maintaining the appearance of not needing anything. For the conversations with David and Susan that could now be more honest about everything, because I'd established that I could be honest about the body, which made the other honesty more natural. The lighter relationship with the body turned out to produce a lighter relationship with almost everything, because the physical competence fiction had been one of the primary ways I was maintaining a kind of managed distance from the people who loved me. And when the fiction went down, some of the distance went with it. The third thing I wish I'd avoided, and this is the one that cost me the most, and that I want to take the most time with, because I think it's the most important and the least obvious, is the specific kind of loneliness that comes from deciding you don't need people in the ways that are hardest to admit to. I want to distinguish this from ordinary solitude, which I value and which is not the same thing. Solitude is the chosen aloneness of a person who has other options, and has chosen, temporarily, to be alone. Solitude is the morning in the shop before the calls start, the evening by the fire before the conversation begins, the particular quiet of a winter morning in Maine before anyone has made demands on the day. I love solitude. I'm good at it. After 82 years, I know how to be alone in a room, and to find the alone genuinely good rather than a default condition I'm enduring. What I did in the second and third year after Helen died was something different. I let the solitude become a system. I let it become the organizing principle of the days rather than one of several modes of being. I stopped reaching out with the small-scale social initiations that had always been part of the texture of my life. Stopping to talk to the Sullivans when I saw them at the end of the road, calling Bob on a Tuesday for no particular reason, dropping something off at a neighbor's house not because they needed it, but because I wanted to have a reason to be somewhere else for 20 minutes, and to see another face. I stopped doing those things, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the gradual way that small social habits stop when the person who used to organize them around, Helen, who had always been the more socially initiating of the two of us, is no longer there to organize around. And the system worked, in the narrow sense. The days were quiet. The mornings were mine. The evenings were undisturbed. I was not bothered, not obligated, not required to be anyone's company, or to receive anyone's attention, or to perform any version of okayness that I didn't feel. I was thoroughly, completely alone. And it was exactly as efficient as that sounds, and exactly as costly. The cost was the particular thing that only the presence of other people can provide, which I know sounds circular but is the most accurate way I can put it. It is the thing that conversation gives you that silence doesn't give you, which is not just the information or the comfort or the company, but the experience of being seen by another person, in real time, as the specific person you are right now today. The journals I keep and the conversations I have with Helen in my interior are real and valuable, and I don't want to minimize them. But they don't give me the particular thing that David gives me when he says something on a Sunday call that makes me laugh in a way I didn't expect, or that Susan gives me when she says something on a Thursday that shows she's been thinking about me specifically, with the specific knowledge of who I am that comes from 55 years of being my daughter. Those moments locate me. They say, "You are here, you exist. You are seen by people who know you, and the knowing matters to them enough that they're still paying attention after all these years." I let myself be underlocated for about 2 years. I let the system of solitude run long enough that the underlocation became noticeable to the people looking from the outside, before I could see it from the inside. Susan said something to me on a Thursday call sometime in the second year that I've thought about many times since. She said, "Pop, you seem further away than you used to be." And I said, "I haven't moved." And she said, "I know you haven't moved. That's not what I mean." She meant that the version of me she was reaching when she called was a more distant version than the version she'd been used to reaching. That the solitude system had moved me back from the edges of my relationships in a way that she could feel even through the phone, even in the managed fine I was giving her every Thursday. I want to tell you about the specific thing that began to reverse it, because I think the specific is always more useful than the general. It was a Wednesday in November, the particular Wednesday I've mentioned in other conversations, when a man named George called. George was someone I'd known in passing for years, a man who had also lost his wife, whose wife had died about 8 months before Helen. He called because someone had mentioned Helen to him, and he was calling in the way that grieving people sometimes call each other. Not because they have anything particular to say, but because the calling is what the moment asks for. And I almost didn't answer. I was in the solitude system. The Wednesday evening was mine. The phone represented an intrusion on the quiet I'd been living in. I answered because something in me that was still connected to the older habits of my social life said, "Answer the phone, Walter." And I did. We talked for almost 2 hours, about our wives, about the specific quality of a house after a wife is gone, about the things we'd done in the months since, about the things we hadn't done, about the ways we'd both been retreating without quite acknowledging that we were retreating. George was in his own version of the solitude system. He recognized what I was describing because he was living the same thing, in a different house, in a different town, with the same organizational logic. And the recognition, the specific experience of being recognized in something you'd been too alone to name, was one of the things that began to break the system open. I saw George twice more, for coffee, before he moved to be near his daughter in New Hampshire. We're not close in the way that people who've known each other for decades are close. The depth wasn't there to build on, but those 3 conversations were part of what I needed to remember what the conversations were for. They were for the location, for the being seen by another specific person in real time, for the experience of mattering to someone else's attention in the immediate moment, rather than only in the accumulated past. I started tending the web after that. The small social habits, the calls initiated for no particular reason, the yes to the Sullivan's invitation, the regular coffee with Elaine from down the road, the monthly lunch with Marie, Bob's widow. Not dramatically, not as a project, just quietly, the way you tend things that you know from experience require tending, where they thin out and stop being there when you need them. What I wish I'd avoided is the 2 years in the solitude system before George called. Not the solitude itself. The solitude is not the problem, but the particular pride that kept me from admitting I needed the location that only other people can provide. The same pride that kept me from telling David I'd fallen, kept me from telling anyone, including myself, that I was lonelier than I was admitting and that the loneliness was costing me things I could feel but wasn't quite naming. The naming is what changes things. When I finally named it, first to myself, in the chair one evening, honestly, without the managed fine, I could start doing something about it. The something was small, as I said. Answering the phone, saying yes to the invitation, calling first, without waiting for someone else to initiate, showing up at the Sullivans with no reason other than the wanting to see them and the knowledge that the wanting was enough. And here is what I found when I started doing those small things. The web that I thought had thinned irreparably had not thinned irreparably at all. The people were still there. They'd adjusted to the version of me that was harder to reach, but they were still there, still interested, still glad to hear from me when I reached out. The 2 years in the solitude system had made them less likely to initiate. They'd learned that I wasn't reliably available, so they'd stopped expecting me to be. But the adjustment was reversible. When I became reliably available again, when I started initiating again, the web started thickening again. Not all the way back to what it had been when Helen was alive and helping to maintain it. That version isn't coming back, because she was a large part of what held it together, but to something functional, something genuine, something that locates me daily in the world of people who know me and whose knowledge of me matters to them. That's what I was avoiding by maintaining the solitude system. Not the absence of people, there were people available, but the vulnerability of needing them. The admission that at 80 years old, living alone in a house that has been quiet for going on 3 years, I needed to be located by other people in real time. That the journals and the interior conversations and the solitude were not enough. That the presence of another face and another voice doing the specific work of attending to me was something I required in a way that the pride of my formation had not previously allowed me to describe as a requirement. It is a requirement. It was always a requirement. The long marriage and the children in the house and the crew at the job site, and the daily social fabric of a working life. have been providing it so constantly and so automatically that I didn't notice it as a requirement until all of that was gone, and I was alone in a quiet house and slowly understanding what the quiet was actually costing. I want to say something about what the cost of the underlocation actually looks like in the daily texture of a life. Because I think this is easier to feel than to name, and I want to try to name it. When you are regularly seen by people who know you, when the daily or weekly contact with people who care about you is in place and functioning, there is a particular quality of groundedness that you carry through the ordinary day. You know who you are to other people. You have recent evidence of mattering to specific people who know the actual you rather than a general you. That evidence functions as a kind of ballast. It doesn't make the difficult days not difficult, but it keeps the difficult days from becoming the whole of what's real, keeps them in proportion, keeps them inside a life that is also attended to by others, rather than a life that is only attended to by yourself. When the underlocation set in, when the web had thinned enough that the regular being seen was happening less often, I noticed something about the difficult days. They became larger, not because the content of them was worse, not because more was going wrong, but because the ballast was gone, and without the ballast the difficult days had more weight in the accounting than they would have had if I'd been regularly grounded by the contact. A bad night's sleep, when I was regularly talking to people who knew me, was a bad night's sleep. A bad night's sleep in the full operation of the solitude system was a data point, in a story I was starting to tell myself about what my life had become. The story was not accurate. The story was a product of the isolation rather than a description of the situation. But I couldn't see that from inside the isolation, and that's the thing about the cost of underlocation. It clouds the very instrument you'd use to assess it. You need other people to see clearly. When you don't have other people, your seeing goes wrong in ways you can't detect from the inside. The fire's burned very low. The morning is almost entirely gone. Outside, the November light is the particular honest gray of the end of the year, which doesn't ask anything of you and doesn't offer much either, but which has its own kind of beauty. If you've been in Maine long enough to find beauty in the honest gray. I have been in Maine long enough. I find beauty in a lot of things I wouldn't have found it in at 50, which is one of the genuine gifts of having gotten to 82, despite everything. 3 things. The grief that became a permanent winter, the physical pride that kept me from asking for what my body needed, and the loneliness I maintained by deciding I didn't need people, in the ways that were hardest to admit. All 3 connected, if I look at them together, all 3 versions of the same deep habit, and which is the habit of managing the interior at the expense of the interior's actual condition, of presenting to the world and to myself a version of Walter that was more capable and more self-sufficient and less in need than the actual Walter, and paying the costs of that presentation in ways that took me years to fully see. I see them now. I'm working on them still, imperfectly. Some mornings more successfully than others. But the seeing is the beginning of the working on. And the working on, even imperfect, is better than the not working on that I did for the 2 years after Helen died, when I was running the solitude system and the grief is permanent season system and the physical pride system all at once, and calling the whole operation fine. It was not fine. It was Walter managing himself in the absence of the person who had been the primary check on his management for 54 years. It was the 80-year-old version of me finally having to do the interior work that the marriage had been doing partly for him, and the doing of it slowly, imperfectly, in the chair by the fire in the years since, is some of what this channel has been. The public version of the interior work, shared in the hope that some of it is worth something to someone who is also working on the same things. If anything I said today reached you, you can subscribe to walk with me a while longer. I read every comment. Tell me which of the 3 you recognized. Tell me about the season that lasted longer than it needed to, or the pride that cost you more than it was worth, or the loneliness you maintained by deciding you didn't need what you needed. I'd like to know. Take care of yourself. Let the winter season end. Ask for the help. Answer the phone. And if you're in the solitude system right now, if the quiet has become the organizing principle rather than one of several modes, I want to say this as plainly as I can say it. It is reversible. The people are still there. They've adjusted to the version of you that's harder to reach, but they haven't left. They're waiting with more patience than you probably think they have, for the version of you that reaches back. Reach back. The web will begin to thicken again. It always does, if you start tending it. The fire's still going. I'll see you next time.